Hi, everyone. This is David Beckworth of Macro Musings, another podcast produced here at the Mercatus Center. On my podcast, we focus on pulling back the curtain on the important macroeconomic issues of the past, present, and future. You can join the conversation on Twitter at macro_musings and subscribe to the show wherever you find your podcasts.
Welcome to Ideas of India, a podcast where we examine academic ideas that can propel India forward. My name is Rajesh, and today my guest is Rajesh Veeraraghavan, an assistant professor of science, technology, and international affairs at Georgetown University. We spoke about his book, Patching Development, Information Politics and Social Change in India. We talked about patching governance systems akin to patching software, fiscal federalism, decentralization, and social audits, whether technology can cure all in India, economic growth, academia, comedy, and much more. For a full transcript of this conversation, including helpful links of all the references mentioned, click the link in the show notes or visit discoursemagazine.com. Hi Rajesh, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Shruti. Finally get to see you and hear you.
I just read your book, Patching Development. You make this great analogy of patching development as something that you got from patching software. And this is essentially, bits of code designed to fix specific parts of a larger software system that is glitching or not, working as originally planned or designed. And you use this analogy to place designing of governance problems and the last mile implementation problem, in particular with the NREGA program in Andhra Pradesh. So, this is just to place the book in context. I want to take this analogy of patching development and patching software a little bit further. Patching, as you acknowledge, is top-down. It is fine-grained, it is iterative, especially in governance systems. My question is more about open versus closed systems, right? In software, I imagine that for open systems, it's much easier to patch because there's an element of, lots of trial and error, different people coming in, almost like a hive mind nature to it. Now, with governance systems, the closest analogy I can find is monocentric versus polycentric systems, right? And monocentric systems are going to have not just glitchy design, but also more glitchy patching, so to speak. Is this a good way to think about overall governance problems in the analogy that you've pointed out so far?
So, excellent question. So, let me first start that the patching, idea is, you're right that it is well suited for, or originates from the software world, and is well suited for an open source environment where what gets patched gets decided at different levels and different people patch it or tries to send the patch. And then there's, even if it's a Linux model, top-down model, somebody decides to patch it down, right? So in that sense, even the open source model, there's a bureaucracy, there is team of one in some cases decides what gets patched, because it's not like you don't want forks of even an open system, million different patches on a same system. It's going to be hard. But there are other systems, even closed source, like the software system I'm using, Windows, for example, have it's closed source, and it still have we might be having this call, and then Windows update might decide there's a patch needs to be installed. What I'm trying to say is, it's not necessary that you need to have an open system, though there are advantages to it that you can have patching going on. And so what I'm trying to do is there's two things. One is to describe what actually happened in Andhra, not so much necessarily to kind of celebrate it and not to kind of critique it, but also kind of document, understand it, describe it, plus kind of the kind limitations, so to speak, that might come from the kind of question you're alluding to: who decides to patch? And it's, does it make sense to have a much more open system of governance that let people fix these systems of problems? And I think we're not there yet, so I think that the hope is that, this metaphor or this kind of theory lets you kind of imagine different arrangements of power where you can yield, or you can give power, where you can actually have these patching being decided at the local level and being issued. And that's definitely possible in the framework that I'm building. But the empirical material that I gather in this case has a much more, it's solving a particular problem with a certain hierarchy and local power systems.
The example that you've chosen to, set your inquiry in is NREGA, which is, of course, a central scheme, but needs to be implemented at the local level because it's an employment guarantee program, right? But it is designed very much as a union government, highly centralized scheme, which looks at the country sort of as a whole, right? At the planning stage. Having said that, it is very quickly apparent to everyone, both those who are designing and implementing, that this requires a vast amount of discretion. And that is also where your patching metaphor starts kicking in, right? The discretion can be at multiple levels, but in this case, let's just say the discretion is somewhere shared between upper level bureaucrats, middle level bureaucrats, and then the absolute local level bureaucrats and implementation partners, right? Is this a fundamental problem that one just simply cannot get out of, that if you have a centralized program, you're going to have to give vast amounts of discretion, which is going to lead to this kind of patching, which is again iterative, granular, lots and lots of trial and error, so to speak, but, within a linear system. On the other hand, the only way to get out of it is to completely decentralize or federalize, right? And then the discretion gets taken away, so that's the plus. But on the other hand, you cannot have these large, big idea schemes that actually touch large numbers of people across the country, whether it is vaccination, whether it is employment guarantee, whether it is midday meals, or, whatever it is, whichever scheme that's in question. So is this just the fundamental problem?
Yeah, so you're right. The NREGA is a central program, and the design of it actually took decades of work, starting from the Maharashtra AGS. The program is a centralized program, and it's national, and it's and it was supposed to be full the entire year. The first small problem could not be fully solved, and they compromised to 100 days of work for any willing rural citizen to work as a family. It's not 100 days per person, 100 days per family to work on public lands and on demand, meaning whenever they want work, it should be given. So it's a right. It's a big difference between a project and a program and a right-based program, where again, it's all in theory, as the spirit of whether how much rights are actually exercised is debatable. But the idea has been that it's a right that people can demand work, and they should be given within 5 kilometers with equal wage between men and women, and with a minimum wage that's prescribed. And this is manual work largely. They also specified the amount of material amount that can be allowed, because the worry was that it'll all be gone to the contractors and not the laborers who actually are benefiting from it. So there's two goals. One is to actually give employment. The other is to actually build useful assets in the village so that they can build there's an environmental side to it too, though it's more in theory than practice. So that's the kind of whole game. And the money is centrally given, guaranteed, and the money flows down to the states. And different states have different ways of implementing it. And one key thing that was again in the design and picked up by Andhra was this idea of social audits, where you have, well, I should just say the what is the work, right? So the work is bonds, clearing forest land and useful assets and maintenance of canals and all of that. That's decided at the local level, and people go and work as a team. They have a attendance register which records work, and people need to get paid. At some level, it's a very simple thing, right? You have to work and you got to get paid. And sometimes I'm like, gosh, so much work, so much research happened in this very simple design problem, right? In some sense, where all you're doing is you're allowing, the reason why they want to do this is because of self-targeting, right? The idea is that people self-select to go work on these public lands, because otherwise the rich will take away the money. And so the idea is to kind of create an incentive for people to work and build useful things. And so that's one way of kind of staving off corruption at the local level. And you need to get paid. So the constraints is like, how do you disperse money where these people are not on bank accounts and it's not easy to kind of send money to people for the work they received. And so what kind of structures that you need to create in place to ensure that they get paid and they get it on time. So that's the payment. So that's the kind of design of the program, you need to get work within 5 kilometers. Men and women have to have equal wages. You need to have a shade. You need to have, the type of work that should be allowed is of a certain type. Those are all design choices that were thought through. And yes, it was centralized in the sense it was specified as as code in some sense, as part of the policy that applies to all. There is no flexibility in some sense at those rules. So you can't pay men and women different wages. In fact, that's the norm in most other settings, even agricultural labor, for example, to get different wages, right? So there is something to say about the fact that these programs, NREGA particularly, have a lot of design things that is going right. And NREGA the money is actually decided at the federal level or the central level, right? Because, we know the recent issues with that setup of throttling. The idea is there's a lot of flexibility given to the state. So in fact, Sandeep studies this and points out that there are multiple NREGAs, right? Every state has different outcomes. And so that's because even though you have a lot of specifications about you should have a social audit unit, well, Andhra for the longest time was the only state that actually had a social audit unit. Now that's changed, so the fact that you have things on the law doesn't mean that these things are practiced, right? So in that sense, I think there were a lot of flexibility in the system to allow subnational states to actually have control over the program. So, but your question is more about whether can we now magically move to a way where you don't have this problem, because by definition, if you have a centralized program, you need patching and ways to deal with it. In fact, I spent in the introduction, and there's another article where I spent time thinking about what is the central problem, right? Which is centralization and decentralization. And, and information is one kind of central way to think about it, in the sense that one of the reasons why centralization is bad is because you don't really know what's happening at the local level. And if you try to fix it, you're going to find a lot of problems on the program. And similarly, if you ideally you want to decentralize power and you give it off, in some states doing a fantastic job at that, in the sense that you can actually have a more equal society. Kerala comes to mind in terms of having a certain kind of preconditions, if you will, where you can actually devolve power and financial power, not just control, but actually having a decision for them to even do whether NREGA or what kind of programs they should do. But in many other states, it's not clear that, at least that's the angle that, the Andhra government has taken. And there's debates we should have about, this. In fact, some of the bureaucrats at the top in the Andhra were Dalits, and they actually kind of subscribe to the Ambedkarian kind of vision of linking about devolving local power in a certain way, right? So they saw villages are not the places where you need to give power to, right? And so they said we have to agree, attend to the fact that there is problems with the fee implementation, which is a way to reach out to the workers. So it's decentralized in the sense of reaching out to kind of what is the problems from how the workers see it, but you still retain control in terms of, what projects gets done, when it is done. And so that's the kind of dance they had. Yeah, but it comes with the territory, right? Because that's where the local power structure, that's why it's constant cat and mouse patching.
But the funny thing is exactly what Ambedkar and others were trying to prevent, right? They thought of, highly local, especially the village structure, as dens of, parochialism, right? And casteism. And exactly the problem they were trying to solve for by centralizing, you point out, still exists. Because at the end of the day, no matter how much you centralize, the last mile cannot be resolved unless you actually get into the weeds and talk through the local power structures of what is happening between the Reddys and the beneficiaries of the NREGA program. Or, sometimes that there's a group that skims off the top typically, and there's a group that's preventing the skimming off the top. So there's going to be some local issue at each point. But to me, what was interesting about your book was you point out that no matter how much you centralize, at some point, you've got to solve that problem. And technology ain't going to do it for you. Right? It is still an institutional problem. It is still an incentive problem. Something else needs to be disentangled to make this ship run as it was designed.
Yeah, and I think, there's been recognition. Peter Evans talked about institutional monocropping and how to avoid it and have different arrangements. But I think what I'm trying to argue here is that's not enough. It's not just you kind of hit play once you figure out a local context and then, oh, I've magically studied this in one time, one game. Whether it's technology, whether it's institution, it needs to be, especially in an unequal setting. I mean, I thought you were asking, one of the questions was, when is this going to end? Well, when we have an equal society, when we actually have power, more people are able to exert power at various levels seamlessly, then you would have a scenario where you don't need to kind of patch, because that could be done at the local level, and we wouldn't be here debating how even despite all these years you're still coming back to the same question of how do you solve this question of delivery. And I think I just want to add one more thing to this, which is lots of attention has been focused on political will and when do states decide to focus on the poor, or what does it take? Is it party competition? Is it social movements? All of that. Or economists focus on a lot about how do you perfect the design? Should it be like, in fact, a lot of people in your show, for example, talked about if there's women elected at the local level, does it lead to better delivery? And how do you design these things? Should you have biometrics or not? Karthik studies that. I think what I'm trying to kind of shed light on, and not to necessarily support what Andhra did and the model, but to say that the last mile problem of local power system simply cannot be seen as corruption and then kind of looked at it that way, but actually tried to kind of look at the details of it. And I would just one last thing about, you mentioned caste and other forms of workers themselves. NREGA workers were also part. I mean, if you the difference between mates who has had at least a little bit more power than workers, right? And so they were skimming off the other workers. So it's, in the sense, it's much more complicated than just somehow leaving it to the local, right?
Now, let me flip it for you. How would this patching mechanism work if the last mile were in fact the first mile? That is, India were much more fiscally federal. The processes were bottom up, right? There were people who, there was a much tighter feedback loop between people who are voting and people who are paying taxes or user fees for various, public goods and services.
So what he's saying is in a Kerala type system where, say, 40% of money, X amount of money parked at the local level, and they decide at the local level what projects to do. And so I think in Kerala it works, right? And in Andhra it might work if given a chance. Maybe things are changing as I see, but maybe I don't want to be seen overly defending the kind of the Ambedkar vision that the bureaucrats in Andhra had. As an academic, kind of trying to kind of get out of it. But the way they would answer your question is, well, we see that if you read this book, for example, and you have, but for others, public meetings. Conducting public meetings, even in this setup, a Gram Sabha or a Rachabandha or any of these kind of meetings I studied, people are speaking out more. And, our friend Biju Rao has documented brilliantly how that works across states and articulates how the idea of speaking in these public spaces has changed. And I've seen it as well. 10 years ago, you could not have a banner which talks about celebrating, Christmas. Would not be possible in a village town square. And now it's, I was told that, hey, watch this. It's something important going on here. And I was like, barely noticed it. And I realized that, oh, things are changing. So people are speaking out, public spheres are opening up. But the Andhra bureaucrat would tell you that we are still not there where that dream of yours, where you can flip it, is ready, because their worry would be contractor Raj. All the things that you saw that we've seen before in terms of money getting taken away in different projects, I would think that the landless laborers, 48% of the NREGA workers are Dalits and Adivasis, right? At least in 2014 or so. And so there's a big power asymmetry that exists. At least Andhra and other parts of the country are ready for that kind of decentralization, because that would need a different kind of social movements and decentralized collective action that has to continue on in order for that to be more egalitarian and more democratic in the full sense. So the worry is whether they would, if you park that money, they would take it away, and you won't have equal wages, you won't have work being granted, you would have money, NREGA money being used to work on subsidized farmer private land work, right? All the things that the design of this NREGA program tried to solve. So they would basically tell you that, hey, we're not yet there where we could flip it. because, we're not ready. And some of it, you can push back saying, well, you're still hoarding power, which is true. I think I point out how the first mile prompts are never gone. It's just 100 days. They don't reveal any of their documents. And I barely got to see any of it. So it's slightly more complicated that I don't think we get there to, at least that's what they would say, to kind of fully decentralize power. But that's the direction we should go. There's no reason to kind of hold power at this level.
For me, it's not about, is this going to work exactly as we designed, but more of which system through various processes of trial and error is more likely to get it right eventually, right? So that's the way I think about it. And for me, fiscally federal systems, truly federal systems, are more often than not likely to get it right. One, because the scale is small, experimentation is easier. You can get many different versions of the same thing. You can sort of learn from each other. You can have voting, with the feet. You can have so many other disciplining mechanisms to a given problem relative to centralized systems. So the idea is not that the problem's going to magically disappear, but more of, if to use your patching metaphor, how quickly, does the feedback loop work to get any system to the right place faster? One big problem, as we've been talking about, is discretion, right? Discretion is absolutely necessary when we have these highly centralized schemes. Are you at all worried about mission drift and mission creep? Right? Obviously, a centralized program looks different in each state, and it's supposed to look different in each state. But some of it is because the local context is different, and some of it is because the discretion has just led to the program morphing into something completely different, right? What is a way to think about that while you're looking at programs like NREGA, given that all the different, stakeholders at the end of the day want the same thing? They want some kind of transparency and accountability.
So the first question is what discretion at what level for and by whom, right? So definitely at the subnational state, right? The NREGA, there's full discretion in terms of, yes, there is a bill of projects that's allowed at the top, but then the different states interpret it. So, so first of all, there's a subnational discretion. The principal secretary of Andhra Rural Development decides a lot of things. So there's a lot of discretion. And not just principal secretary, I meant like the whole EGS head at that level. In Andhra, the discretion is hoarded at that level. But one of the key elements of Andhra's implementation was this idea of social audits, where the big problem in states is that opacity of, thanks to the British Secrecy Act, misused that, and basically saying all the expenses of records of government documents are not opened up to anybody other than the people, the government people, the bureaucrats at the local level. And it's never been seen. And there's been a struggle. And, Himanshu talk about, I think I need to correct, this the digital version. I'll put a footnote. I'll have a correction to his history of starting the story much before than the social movement story. But the idea is that there has been a struggle to enact a right to information, which allowed for social audit to be inserted into this law, which allows for opening up these records, which is attendance registers and whatnot, in order to counter-examine the government records, right? And so they have a social audit process, a team which goes to the village once in 6 months to examine these records, goes door to door, does a household survey, and of covering every person in the NREGA worker, assignment sample, and then conducts a village meeting. And then there's in Andhra, there's something called mandals, which is like half the block, let's say, if you're used to think about administrative blocks, and conduct another meeting where they would have district bureaucrats come in, and essentially a way to kind of neutralize power there. So those decisions at the village level, at the mandal level, gets escalated up and decided like a court, where they say, okay, here is the auditor's finding based on discussing with the workers. They said, I come to you and you said, did you work on NREGA and you get paid? How much did you get paid this last season? And did you work 20 days? No, actually, I worked 80 days. And did you get paid? The record says you got 1,600 rupees, and you'll say, no, I only got 300. And that's the thing they want to note down. And that they're trying to kind of do that door to door and have these meetings at two different levels to kind of adjudicate the publicly open, where they can discuss these findings and then take a decision on, hey, how do you reconcile this, and in almost kind of having a deterrence effect in some sense, right? In terms of like, well, this audit is happening, it's objective from the outside, and so that puts pressure on a lot of gaze on these records. Now workers actually can know that, hey, this is I have a chance to kind of see the workings of the state and write. I use this metaphor, writing the state in some sense, where they can actually not just consume records or see it, but actually ability to kind of change it. And so that's the setup of the structure of what the Andhra implementation tried to do.
And you've come in at 2 points in this, right? One is you've actually sat through the social audits in your fieldwork. So that's part one of it. But part two of it is you're also studying it in the larger context of how technology, in particular, this, current obsession with digital governance, right? We're going to have these biometric things. We're going to have bank accounts. We're going to digitally transfer cash. And then they almost make it seem as if then the need for these social audits and other mechanisms goes away, right? That's the idea of the technology. So can you put that in perspective? Now, where does this kind of back and forth governance and social audit system fit in, and where does technology fit into this story?
Yeah, so I would say there are three different, my fieldwork was in 3 different phases. The first phase was definitely at the auditors, right? So they would, shadow the auditors and try and like do audits with them. And that was more about getting information from the bottom, right? From the field. And the second was the interaction between the bureaucrats, so the higher level and the lower level bureaucrats. And that's where the technology was used largely to essentially monitor and keep track, this payment system was one aspect of it, but the kind of control of the kind of very, very small things like, and this is not news for any bureaucrat. But for me, it was really surprising to kind of amount of attention to detail in terms of, what columns should be read only, how do you geotag, how do you know work is getting done, geotag the work, and the kind of, obviously it's not a one-time fix. And so the people would say, okay, they would game that system by not even showing to the field, but sending the phones. And so there's a lot of dance. So any tech evangelist should basically take note that this is, if you really want to use tech, read that chapter to kind of understand how much you have to stick into the game to kind of play this, because it's not like, yeah, I did biometrics, I do Aadhaar, and I have nothing against in theory about any of these systems, but it's a very simple story that what it assumes it somehow that the people at the other end are just waiting for some device to come and then magically solve it. Right? They're dealing with it. They're coping with it, right? And they sabotage it, right? And so you need to kind of step ahead. You need to patch these systems. And if you're ready to do that, I think, and play that level of politics with tech, then sure, tech is just a tool. But it's not a magic pill at all. So none of these systems are going to be. And so Andhra bureaucrats, to give them credit, they actually were not naive. They're not technology determinists at all, right? So they were quite savvy. And then the third aspect of my fieldwork was actually trying to kind of go and spend time in 2 different contexts. And at least one made it in the book, the other didn't. An Adivasi and the Dalit village. I mean, a big village, but a Dalit habitation is where I stayed.
You compared this in your world development paper. So
yeah, I did. Yeah. So on the tech question, I think Andhra has some lessons to teach the world about using tech in a way. The question about should you use technology or not is a question that I didn't ask, because I studied what they did. And the only answer to the broader question is, if you want to use tech to solve a problem, be prepared to, keep changing and don't go and proclaim that whatever your favorite tech system is going to fix things, right? And of course, I'm not against there are studies that would point out. In fact, I use it very well in my book to show that how biometrics actually has an impact, and that's true. It has an impact. That's only one small part of what the Andhra story. So they want to. Again, it goes back to the centralization question. They want to control who works on which land. They wanted to enforce it. You studied legislative kind of updates, right? Here they want to make sure that I want an upper caste person to work on Dalit land, because you're only allowed to work in a public land or on a Dalit land. And so that they had to enforce by saying, I am going to tag the work and you can't change it. and they make, software systems allows for those restrictions, right? And again, I mean, if you read it, it's a mess because it's like it doesn't solve like problems. It creates new problems, and you have to keep changing it, and yeah, it's an ever ending. So I wrote another paper on it. It's called cat and mouse game. So it's a which you have to keep changing it, and if you have to keep on top of it.
There's also that aspect of if you think technology is going to solve the problem, then people are going to try and game it, right? It's almost as if it invites the next stage cat and mouse problem. If you're going to say we're going to geotag things, then people are going to just use the geotag and, to put it in place and not take the people themselves. If you say that, we're going to solve this using direct transfers to bank accounts, then they're going to try and control fake bank accounts open in names of these people. These people have never seen a bank account themselves, but apparently money has been deposited in it. So these things one keeps hearing, both in your book and outside in, all sorts of stories of governance questions in India. But there seems to be this sense, especially with the current government, that some kind of digital system transformation, right, is going to solve your typical governance problems. And to me, I mean, as an economist, I only see incentive problems. So I'm like, okay, the technology can't fundamentally change the incentives, right? It can change costs and constraints. It can't change the interests. So what can technology do and not do within the larger setup of these kinds of governance problems?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. I think, it's like law, right? In India, where, why do you think about laws, right? Do laws are able to govern action on the ground? Yes and no, right? I mean, yes, there are certain things that it helps you, puts a constraint on you, right? So the best possible answer to the tech system, I imagine, is put constraints and increases the legibility or increases transparency of payment systems if you want to, keep records of it so you can actually see what's going on much more quickly, much more transparently. And so there are benefits in using tech because it puts a certain kind of constraint and there's a certain immediacy to it, like the fact that a lot of people are thinking about digitizing government records and whatnot. Well, what does it do? It doesn't. If I'm fudging it at the beginning source, I fudge it digitally, right? So it's not. So one could say, yeah, you're not solving the incentive problem. But the question is, I mean, technology does have politics also. So it does have, like Twitter, for example, right? The 180, I mean, this is the classic STS trope where, maybe the design of the tech in a particular way does allow for a certain kind of rhetoric to be echoed more because people want to see, it's easy to express hate or anger in a very short, crisp thing rather than nuanced statement. So I guess my point is technology constrains action, just like legal, laws might. But the tendency is, and I'm trying hard to make this point in the book. I want to see whether I think using technology is not immediately it's not a technocratic move, right? So you could use technology and in a very political way, right? And one example, this is not about technology, but like in a broader sense of technology, not digital technology, the attention to kind of micro details. For example, in Georgia, there's a recent law got passed where water bottles, if you're waiting in a line to vote, you shall, water bottles should not be given to people standing online. And that's a very silly, like, kind of rule. Like, why would you think about passing a law like that? Well, if you're poor, if you're standing in line and for long periods of time, it's a disincentive. It goes to the incentive question, right? It's basically say, oh God, I'm gonna might as well just get out the line, or I'm not going to get water, right? So so I think it puts that constraint on people, and so I think use of tech needs to be seen. Not be dismissed as technocratic moves, has to be seen in its political dimensions, and needs to, one needs to be much more careful about not like, the cheap dismissal as well. This is a technocratic. No, it's actually a very political move, and needs to. I'm saying we need to kind of worry a lot about, how political the use of technology is, and it's a very kind of it's a point that I'm hoping that that I make. Okay. And I hope it's convincing because I think the biggest thing is there's let's get the politics right, incentives right, and all the rest is just technocratic. And I'm saying, well, people, you play politics at these very micro, what can be seen technocratic ways? Where do you conduct meetings? What you wear? Should you allow to eat meat or not? These are all technical things. But you could see how it plays out, right, in the book.
Yeah, you have a great story in there about someone who's from a, Dalit caste who's wearing a white shirt and is in a very pointed way sent to a particular field to work on a particular project, just so his white shirt will get soiled, because that's the way to put someone in their place, right? In given a particular kind of power structure. And it's sort of stunning that and these things cannot be legislated and they cannot be solved through a governance system. It's got to be figured out some other way.
You're right. I mean, I was pretty I didn't believe him. And he was, because I was shocked to see that level of
malevolence
in people to kind of say, okay, I see a white shirt, I want to soil it by creating a new work, right? I mean, I think that's, but I was struck by how much caste. Of course, we know class plays a role, but caste playing a role in very, very, very powerful ways that actually impact the program.
But that level of politics, I completely agree with you that, there is politics to technology. But, if we zoom out, the use of technology itself is political, right? And I mean this, if we look at something like what James C. Scott writes, Seeing Like a State is one of my favorite books. And he talks about legibility as the central problem of statecraft, right? That's sort of his perspective. So there's this necessary, simplification, systematization, miniaturization, like, you pick your word, that absolutely needs to happen at the very fundamental level of designing these systems and any kind of intervention that we bring in, especially at that kind of top-down, highly centralized way. So I know what you mean. I mean, when you're talking about the politics of technology in the book, you're talking about this very micro kind of, where it becomes political. But the way we're thinking about using technology, biometric cards or, these QR codes for vaccination to, allow entry or prevent entry, these things itself, by the very nature of their design, are political, right?
Yes, there is some naivete in it. In people's, you can give them the benefit of doubt, right? Once some could say that, oh, there is this new shiny object, and then they somehow think that the problems are going to go away, and that's clearly not. We don't need. They tried this in any single gimmick that we've seen people try. That's not seem to. Problems don't seem to go away. So you can fault them for being like simple-minded, or maybe I think what you're suggesting is maybe they're much more much more political, in the sense that much more they know what they're doing, and then it's possible that it is a kind of a distraction, and slogans like digital governance and whatnot are just distractions from the whole Aadhaar debate. I'm trying to be a non-deterministic in that argument. I think more and more I'm convinced that it seems to be like one of those demonetization kind of things, where it seems to be like the way they're implementing it is not how you could have done it. You could have used it. So it's become a way to track people. Initially, it was not there. In the recent trips, Aadhaar is becoming, they're forcing it on NREGA too. And it's such a mess that I thought I spent actually some time trying to solve one problem for somebody, saying, well, I have some power on the outside, blah, I understand these technologies. Let me figure out, because the person was denied their benefits because they didn't have Aadhaar. And so I thought I'll solve it. Went up to the local office and reg office and said, well, hey, why is this person not getting? And then they said, oh, it's not linked, and go to the bank. So I said, okay, let's go to the bank. And it's not easy. It's all very crowded. So you go to the bank, and then you go to the bank, and then by the time they get there and they figure out the problem, they realize, well, this is something I actually don't understand. Why are they? This is not even corruption. We're talking about just like details. So they're like, okay, this is not even like matched, and you need to escalate it to the district level. And one of my point is, it's an advanced degree, understanding. I've written code, and I know databases. I know how these things work. No, and the people there, it's not even bad faith. They have no idea how these systems are built. and it's built some in different places. And so there are lots of like unforced errors, if you will, right, where technologies could have created a room for further centralization in a way that maybe as you're hinting, maybe it's intended to kind of in ways that are actually damaging, because it's actually, you don't even need to have you don't need to have local power systems in play now for that to not work, right? You just need to have opacity and centralization that tech provides, which actually makes, and many scholars have pointed this out to say how it seems to be these systems of governance, digital governance, have actually worsened the ability for citizens to make claims, because you could bribe somebody. Talk about incentives. I can bribe you and say, hey, get this thing done. Now I don't even know, because they can't get my work done, because for that to happen, you need to have a different level of hierarchy, and they're sitting somewhere else, if further removed. So that definitely is a huge problem, and I think we should be much more careful of systems that people are building. They don't really understand where it is getting institutionalized, what the network connections exist, how do you escalate it, and there's lots of you're right. I mean, there's a lot of you don't need to get into power and local power systems. The technology in and of itself creates kind of centralization, actually, in ways that is actually not serving the interests of the poor.
What kind of really annoys me about the current tech governance or digital governance debate in India is the way it is being sort of marketed or sold is that, all error is human. And once you move to these digital systems, there is no error, right? We're going to remove all error, like biometrics have very, very low error or something like that. And that is simply not our everyday experience when we entangle with these, tech governance systems. I know people, including my own parents, for whom the KYC has not worked when they have shown up at a particular place at a particular time. I know people for whom, manual laborers, their fingerprints have started, I don't know what the right word is, but fading or maybe don't match exactly and that's just the nature of the work that they do. So every time they go back, the biometrics don't match, and now suddenly that's a really big problem. The idea that just having tech means there is no error in the system, itself is misleading. But I don't know if this has been your experience working within Indian governance. That seems to be the way that this is sold, that, humans are corrupt, computers are not. And the moment we make it digital cash, digital transfer, digital this, digital that, the problem is just going to magically be solved.
Yeah, the chapter on tech particularly, right? I mean, the book has got other things going and institutions and stuff, but the chapter on tech, I think one of the lessons that I want people to have is that it's not, that's why when somebody read this and said, it's so messy story, what are you trying to say? Well, is it fixed or not fixed? Well, yes and no. Yes and no, right? Because it depends on when you end the story. Right? It's continuously happening. In some sense, it's like a cat and mouse game, which basically means that they're fixing things. It's not a negative story, but it's not a story of Kumbaya where you magically, like, I'm never ending that story. And that's why I picked only 3. It's a story that it's clearly the opposite of what the sense that which you said that's giving out to people, that it's not error prone. No, it's fully error prone. Every single thing is complicated, and it's not it's complicated both for tech, of the reasons we talked about in terms of corruption and power and asymmetry, and it's also because people underestimate the precondition that is necessary in a vast country like India in order to have these infrastructural things in place before you actually roll out any system. It sounds, when we're sitting up in Silicon Valley or any of these, even in Delhi or Hyderabad or wherever, in rooms, you think about these things in a very, like, you have a lot of assumptions about what is allowed, what's possible, and every single one of them is actually not true, right? And people don't have network coverage. People are not literate to actually deal with the systems, and they don't have an easy way to fix systems. I think that we underestimate the amount of work that needs to be done. And so I think the Andhra story is actually a story of how to do tech right, because it is a messy story that needs a lot of constant attention. The question now is like, well, should you throw out, is all the problems are because of tech and should be thrown out? I mean, I think that's an open question, whether, in fact, some people are arguing for it, right? We just kind of, and I am a little bit not ready to take that angle, because I think there's some benefits in digitization of public records. It allows for social audit process to much more seamlessly. In Bihar, for example, where I actually, the origin of this book came from, The social audit was very hard to do because you have to manually copy. So there are benefits from actually having digitized records that makes audits more possible. So it's not like return back to a state of paper and then somehow but it's also not a system where, tech magically kind of fixes problems. And I think unfortunately, I think it's a distraction. That's why studying India is ground zero, because it's like, that's where, like, for better or worse, a lot of experimentation is happening in welfare and governance more broadly.
I want to talk about one of the papers that you've written. You have this lovely paper, I believe, with Yashodhara and Toyama on why the relevant constraint is not technology, but context, right? When we're talking about development and governance outcomes. And this is your work about replacing PCs with mobile phones. And this is particularly in the context of, using SMSs, messaging, as the information distribution mechanism system through mobile as opposed to PC in sugarcane cooperatives. So I have multiple questions about, this particular, the paper. The paper is great, and the way you've designed it. What I interpreted or inferred from your paper is sort of like a death knell for all top-down digital tech governance interventions, right? Because what you really need is very high degree of local cultural context and economic and social context to keep in mind what is the relevant technology that is going to work or not work. Sometimes it's paper, sometimes it's a computer, sometimes it's a mobile phone, and sometimes it's something else. I'll start with that question, but I have a few more questions because I really liked what you did with this particular study.
Yeah, so this was I guess I'm dating myself. This was like the first way of what we call it ICTD, or technology for development projects. In fact, I think probably one of the first or second, or at least definitely the first. We claimed it as the first at least written paper on SMS gateways of converting a PC system to an SMS system. We studied this. We call it the Varna unwired, because there's a Varna wired, which was it was the first big project by the government of India where they were experimenting with digitization wave of trying to do governance and trying to kind of use technology. And Ken Keniston, who was my, is no more with my advisor, and he was studying all these projects, and I went with him to kind of, spend some time in the cooperative. And one thing that was very, very clear was, these PC kiosks that were installed in many villages in this case 54 or something, trying to this was, you can pardon them, but that they wanted to solve the world's problems with putting a PC in every village, and said, okay, you can check whatever you want, check market prices. That was the biggest thing, as if the frictions of the market can be saved by just information at the local level. Solgam, they didn't think it through, but just had all this hype about what you can use technology for, and they had created all these kiosks, they networked it. And when I went there, several years later, the thing that the cooperative managed, in fact, one good thing the cooperative managed to run this thing, they actually started using it just for the internal cooperative functioning, to check how, if you're a cooperative member, you can check, they want to know when how much sugarcane is weighed, and they connected it up. It's a neat app. And you can, the amount of weight, how much the weight of the sugarcane, you can get paid, and they tracked the fertilizer expenses and the cost of all of that. Right? It's a very simple, like non-sexy kind of app. And that was the only game in town. And I go there, I'm like, why do you need all this infrastructure and all of these things for just running this one single app? And we tried to say that, we can use it. It was a tech project at the time. So it's an SMS gateway. We said, if you're using it for communication, you don't really need to have PCs, very, very broken PCs and barely running. Cost, we kind of did a pilot. I was at Microsoft Research then, was to kind of show, if this is the app, we can use it with a phone, and it'd be much more, you don't have to even go to a kiosk. You can, and this was, many years ago. So SMSs was not that popular. So it was a project to show that with an SMS system, you could basically transact all the things that you could do with what a computer does. And you're right. It is a case of how tech is useful and could be useful. And if you have and it solves a very particular problem, very narrow problem, and it might not happen in the next set of villages, because this is a cooperative that is taken over and uses it well, and it's an app, a solution for a problem that they actually have, not the next set of villages, right? And so I think your insight is correct, or at least I agree with that. It's a local adaptation, and there's a problem, tech can be used, and it reduces cost, gives more time for people, and it's much more mobile because they don't have to go to this. And it is not solving a problem that I'm going to check agriculture market prices, or I am going to find out my next government program that I need to get a job for. I mean, you know what I mean? Like all these ideas that people had, it just doesn't make sense.
This is not in your paper more directly, but it feels like at each level of economic growth, right, the relevant technology will automatically be adopted. It doesn't need to be forced upon people, right? As people get richer and they get cell phones, they're more likely to start using those cell phones. And eventually, if they first use the cell phones to just talk to their family members, they're eventually going to start using it to figure out agricultural market prices globally or locally for sugarcane. And that doesn't seem that surprising, when one hears it. But it also feels like it's an underappreciated insight in India that if you really want technology to be adopted in a very large way, India needs to just get much richer such that, each person will see the value and be able to afford a certain kind of technology. And maybe one day, instead of a PC in every kiosk, it's a PC in every child's room, right? That's the current problem during the pandemic, that not enough children who are kind of being homeschooled and stuck at home have the relevant technology, and they don't have enough computers and enough mobile phones in poorer areas. So to me, it almost I know this seems very cynical, but also hopeful, right? That the relevant tech solution is economic growth in one sense.
Yeah, no, I think that's true, that you could say that the tech can, the mobile phones, nobody predicted it. Mobile phones happened, and the adoption, nobody expected this level of, reach and use and, missed calls and all sorts of innovations that you could not dream up, right? Everything was an accident. Everything was an innovation hack. Was a jugaad in some sense, and people started using things like this to kind of cope with it. I mean, I think I think we all want growth, and some people want slow down growth too. The question is, whether, I have some questions about whether does it rule away any kind of intentional action towards solving governance problems, right? I mean, so the question is, NREGA, for example, going back to that program, or any welfare programs, tries to deal with things where we are now and tries to kind of cope with the existing inequality that exists, that prevents. So NREGA actually creates more economic, which is surprising, economic bargaining power, even in the limited sense they implemented it, right? Where they increased the wage or at least the bargaining power of these laborers who actually had a little bit extra money, and allows for that kind of freedom to compete at the local level, right? So what I'm trying to say is, one path, again, maybe this is a philosophical distinction, and it's above my pay grade for sure, is whether you get there by just focusing on growth, or does it make sense to kind of address the problems of today about schooling, about health, about employment, and do you need actual intervention, imperfect they may be, So in that sense, I think that is a question that the broader fights happening about, should you just not necessarily trickle down, it's not what you're saying, but having growth, that the pie increases and for everybody, and leave it at that.
But for me, I don't see that as this huge conflicting trade-off that people tend to pose it as. Should we have economic growth, or should we have better outcomes right away? To me, it feels like economic growth is better outcomes, right? They may not be equally distributed among all, but a bigger pie is better. A bigger pie at the very basic level, even if one believes in redistribution, right, as the way out of this problem, a bigger pie is better because it generates more revenue to fund some of these schemes. So at a very basic level, if there's no economic growth, there is nothing else. You can't fund any of the other stuff. Now, the broader question of, is economic growth by itself enough? That's a short-run versus long-run question. But without it, I don't think anything else is possible. There is a mobile phone revolution in India because India grew at 7 to 8% for about 25 years, right? Without that, even with the technology existing, it doesn't matter. Think about something like the light bulb and electricity, right? This technology has existed for 140 years. There's a patent. We know when the patent was created by Edison. People still don't have the ability to just flick a switch and get electricity when they want it in a lot of places in India and parts of the developing world, right? And it's not because we didn't solve the tech problem. It's because they're not rich enough. And we haven't solved some other problems, institutional problems and incentive problems. But as people get richer, they get access to electricity. Voila. Who would have thunk? So this, I think there is less of a conflict between these ideas than is typically posed between the right and the left is my sense of it. I think economic growth overall just does a lot of good things for a lot of people. And, it's the tide that lifts all boats. And I think in the case of the mobile revolution, absolutely. Now, coming to the specific intervention question, I agree with you. We saw during COVID, right? During the pandemic, that an economic stress or demonetization, right? Like a big economic stress, which leads to loss of livelihood for a few weeks or a few months, people are going to start losing their mobile phones, in which case, that's a serious loss of access and inability to collect their benefits or to check their bank accounts or to check agricultural prices or for their children to attend schools and so on and so forth, right? So there is certainly room for short-run interventions at times of economic stress and need. But I don't think a very poor country is going to have the ability to provide PC kiosks or mobile phones, as the case may be.
No, I think you're right about the NREGA budget itself, right? Going back to the welfare schemes, where is that if you're a very poor country, even poorer than us, poorer than India, do we have 190% money from the settled funds to go to the states to be able to do it? So in that sense, you're right that there needs to be a certain level of money available for these programs to in play. But I focused on my work and in the book asking a slightly different question about, if you spend 100 rupees, by the time, I should have tracked it down, but I just didn't. So I don't think I even quoted it in the book. The amount of money that goes to the poor reaches the intended beneficiary.
Yeah, it's 15 paisa to the rupee or something that actually reaches the beneficiary.
Yeah. So people know it. So the question I'm trying to kind of intervene, so I guess the way I'm entering this debate is not to ask the question whether you should give the 100 rupees or not. That's a question that we should have, debate we should have, and people are having it, whether in the right or the left, right? People are saying, well, it's ineffective, it's not reaching. And so what I am trying to say is, or at least take one excuse away, from you can have programs that actually deliver if you focus on dealing with last mile problems, right? Because, and so it's slightly like a kind of, you can still have that other debate, but I'm just saying it's not so much, you don't throw your hand away that easily by saying, well, it's corruption. I'm saying, well, hey, it needs intervention. It needs thought. You need to worry about these details and appropriate earlier conversation. It's not, that's why we've been sitting and talking about it. If it's an easy solutionism, a fix, we would be done. And I'm picking this kind of quote unquote successful case, and I hesitate to say it a success because, it's got its own problems, but, at least definitely a positive case to say, well, there are things that you could do at the implementation stage with things that we've talked about in terms of technology, even institutions. And it's not, and I think I'm interested in seeing how some of the development economists who think about these questions, and some of them you've spoken to, react to this, think about it's how do you do an RCT on if the issue is so complex and if it's so dynamic, how is it that can you study something that's so localized and so particular that can you study it in a way that you can replicate it, right? Because I'm basically saying, well, you need to patch, you need to, whether it's tech or institutions or meetings or documents, it needs a dynamic play because the local power systems are not sitting around and waiting for you to put a biometric device and say, oh God, biometrics has come. Oh, there's a woman is now the sarpanch. Now we're going to deal with no, it's much more complicated. And so I'm eager to see how, even your thoughts on and how much of, and what would a critical response be to say that, hey, this is an important question that cannot be dismissed by the first mile questions, right? And it's just details that people can figure out.
Yeah, I think, in one sense, I'm on your side of this. Like what you're trying to do and what the RCT people are trying to do are completely orthogonal. I see that in the following sense. The entire purpose of these randomized controlled trials is to abstract away from the relevant context, right? And to segregate, right? And study as if, we were comparing apples to apples, except for this one intervention, right? So that's kind of the entire point of it. And they acknowledge that it can't be generalized, right? That's the most fundamental problem of these RCTs in these governance situations, that unlike medical or clinical trials, right? In governance situations, there is a problem with generalizability or external validity of a lot of these things. And I think you have led us to exactly what the problem is, which is this is not a one-shot game. It's highly cultural and contextual, and it requires so many reiterations that you can never have a one and done system design. I wouldn't hold my breath for a good response from the RCT folks, not because they don't mean well or they're not studying what you're trying to study, but it almost seems like you're looking at, an elephant from completely different ends and feeling at completely different ends.
A friend of mine, Sharan, who's actually, we're partnering with him to maybe do an RCT for a project. So, and we're having interesting discussions about, so it's not like, I'm, maybe at some point I was very much more religious about it. And now I've kind of seen benefits in it. And so I think you're right. I mean, I think that there is different ways of looking at it. And the first mile, as I pointed out in the book, the first mile problems are very critical. The questions that people are asking about, when does this, states get seen? When did the states see the poor? What does it take? In fact, there are a couple of chapters documenting like the kind of, things that have happened. I mean, I'm not focused on it as in my empirical work, but it's more context setting. So I want to make sure that people feel like I'm not trying to say that everybody focus on these kind of problems. 100 days is really a cop out. Right. I mean, it is like, it's a compromise, right? It's not 365 days. It's not. And so it's as the original proposal was, right? And so it's so in that sense, so the window that was given was already factored those in, and the programs as implemented, the transparency of it was at the last mile. There was no provision to kind of examine the upper level bureaucrats, what they were doing when their SEZs and any of that. That's not part of this, right? It's a very political window where, you can only get to see certain things that, that was allowed. And so all those points are well taken, right? I mean, in the sense that we should study those things.
Yeah, I'm not collaborating with anyone on an RCT at the moment, so I can afford to be a little bit more critical.
You'll have people on the show.
I'm sure they'll indulge me. If not for anything, just to have a fun debate.
Yes.
I want to talk to you a little bit about, your background, which is integral to writing the book. You sort of come from this, computer science, information systems background, but you also along the way studied economics and governance and a fair bit of political science, if not formally by osmosis and during your fieldwork. So I just wanted to learn a little bit more about how this book came about and how this project came about. And then I'll ask you about how you wrote the book.
Yeah, no. So I have Ramana Maharshi here. So the who am I question, like what is the political? It's a very non-linear path, to say the least. And so, yeah, as you pointed out, it's very hard to place me, I think. Yeah, so I do have a kind of a complicated background in terms of getting exposed to economics early age, and then I thought I'm actually going to be an investment banker. I was working in Bombay in a merchant banking. Oh, I'm sure now showing my age clearly. Investment banking firm, the stock exchange, and so I was very going in a slightly different path. And so I actually came for economics here, and then did computer science later, and then worked at Microsoft for several years as a software developer. And then I think during the time, actually, when I came to the US, then I started seeing India in a very different way. So I started volunteering for this group called AID, Association for India's Development. So that's when I kind of got politicized and got seeing problems of India. It's very ironic, you grow up in India and see all this poverty around, but I was just focused on my track. And then you come back to a different context, and then, the comparative sense. And then, so I was kind of interested in these questions through meeting activists and people were fighting the state and doing development as well as activism. I guess I went back to India again when Microsoft Research started a lab which focused on technology for emerging markets. And that's when those projects came about, looking at cell phones and digital videos and whatnot. So yeah, so then anything beyond social science was so far away for me. So I ended up in the information school, which is a wonderful perch because it allows misfits like me to kind of do whatever they want to do. And I had some fantastic advisors at the sociology department. So I see myself as my formal training was in sociology in terms of my qualifying exam and like my advisors. So that's my kind of training. But I think some of the political scientists now, or in the US at least, in DC, and clearly are leading the way in terms of asking, questions which are very, relevant to my work, right? And so, if you see the book, I'm like, oh, where do you pick the world? Because they're the ones who are kind of ahead, right? In terms of thinking about India, thinking about the state. And so I've really built on that work. So, so the influences are much more broader, than a straight discipline. So clearly a kind of a crawler of sorts. And so your question about writing process, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I know you know how to write code and lots of other cool things, but how do you actually write in particular, this book?
Oh, it's a problem. I think one of my advisors at some point said, "Oh, you like complexity and very way of expressing in writing, which is very dense because I guess that's how you write code in certain ways, and things that are like you take for granted." Need to be spelled out, right? And I've struggled with it, and so the one lesson I've learned over the years is my technique is, and it changes in every stage. But the two broad things I do is, one, I take a recorder, and then speak it out, because it's easier to speak it and then go transcribe it, because it's an empty page. It's hard, at least for the initial So that's one technique. The second technique is to actually go to a board, put a white sheet, and then actually write down somehow the kind of tactile feeling of explaining to somebody, or writing it down helps me. And so all to say that if I sit in front of a computer, nothing happens. So I have to try all these different mechanisms to get words on air, so to speak, and then transcribe them or write them out. And I've heard people on your show talk about it in much more eloquent ways than mine. Mine's much more, it's a hard slog. And I didn't grow up, I wrote code for a long time. So writing continues to be hard. Yeah. And those are my kind of, weapons, if you will, that helps me, or tools that helps me kind of get beyond the blocks of the mind.
Yeah. And now I have to ask you the most important question, which I'm very curious about. So, and this is also giveaway, right? Just how much time I spend watching TV and distract myself in other ways. What have you been binge watching during the pandemic?
So I'm going to disappoint you and bore you by saying that the stuff that I've been listening to are good and random podcasts. And I think the genre of, and this is going to be, I should think about it, I should say this or not, but maybe I'll say it. The genre that I'm, or the type of stuff that I'm actually kind of, you can call it binge watching, meaning there's a pattern to it, or listening. Yeah, so I'm kind of geeking out on the Western philosophical kind of podcast, as well as the discourses on Gita and other and Buddhist texts, and yeah, maybe that's part of my life that but
I can see how one project on Narega can very quickly drive you into asking truly existential questions. Right? No, and maybe one outcome of the book.
No, that is true. So I don't know why, but I think it's intellectually interesting, and I'm also trying to. It sometimes does, one, and academia is a very, as you know, it's a very rough. It's a rough place, and it's a rough. Yeah, I think my advisor used to say that, hey, PhD program, a certain kind of PhD program is an excuse to go and hang out at the communities that you want to and learn from. And so the license to who's going to give you license to go hang out in communities that it's very hard to answer. So that process was fantastic. I don't have to have existential angst. The academic process, on the other hand, on a tenure track kind of situation is quite, I mean, not just tenure track. I think academia generally, I think people, I see it slightly different because I've done other things and, the economic incentives are slightly different for me. And so I think the academic game, people think a little bit too much. The ego is overblown, I think, to the kind of, both, celebrating intellectual achievements as well as maybe facing constant rejections from like journals and whatnot. So I think that there's a heightened sense of self-worth that exists in this game. And so you need some strategies to cope with that, right? So some people, various people, you binge watch is one way to kind of, maybe that's even a better, maybe I should just do that. And this is actually worsens it in some sense. But like, I think there's a lot more suffering because of this attention. And it sees it plays out, right? I mean, this whole like controversy now, like I'm sure you've following that recently, that's happening, in power situations. I mean, I study local power. I see this in academia now, exact same thing, right? And people are kind of, exerting the power over here. I think maybe the same with caste systems, right? It's over decades and years. And so I think that's, I'm not personally affected by it. I've had wonderful advisors and mentors, but I think the structures in place is not healthy at all. And so maybe that's why, I feel the need to do it.
I don't take the whole thing very seriously, I think. And I don't think I take myself very seriously. And that is probably the reason I have kept my sanity through all of it.
That's a gift. That you should tell us how you do it. Like, how does this, like me writing to you, Shruti, wonderful podcast, like, hey, which is sincerely true. And one learns a lot about the book, and people in ways, and so that affects you, and that should affect you, right? Or how do you, if it doesn't, then you have to tell me.
I mean, of course it affects you. Everyone feels fantastic when you get a lovely, heartfelt compliment, and one feels terrible when the reviewer comments are awful. Or having said that, I don't know exactly when it happened, but I think sort of early stages of my PhD, I was terrible at what I was doing. I'm not sure I'm much better now, but at that point I was particularly terrible in articulating anything that I wanted to study. And I got a lot of criticism. And just to keep my sanity, I had to sort of divorce how I feel about myself from how I am doing at work. And that has continued, whether it is a positive feedback or negative feedback. I am not particularly elated when things are amazing at work, and I am not particularly disappointed when things are going badly at work.
No, but you're sharing the outcome, right? That's great. That's the state that one wants to be, right? How did you get there?
I've also been particularly fortunate. I've had really, really solid mentors. I have a very close set of friends who have nothing to do with my work. This, in fact, happened a couple of days ago. A close friend wanted to talk to me, and I was about to walk into a recording with Rukmini about her latest book. And I said, hey, let me call you back in a few hours because I'm walking into a recording. And she said, you started playing music again? Why didn't you tell me? So most of the people who are close to me have no clue what I, do. They certainly don't read what I write. I spend a lot of time with dogs. It's like, the immediate surround sound has very little to do with how one is doing at work. And that is rarely the topic of discussion. I do have very, very close collaborators and friends that I work with, like people I work with who've become close friends. But again, when you have, such close advisors and mentors and collaborators, you've gone past the point of them constantly judging you of how you're doing. Oh, now you're doing okay. Oh, now you're doing terribly. Oh, now you're doing great. So it's usually coming from someone on the outside. And I care so little for those people. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. I think I would just say that, not to always one always finds, oh, I'm in a different place than you. I think there is I think I agree. My friends are all, because of a lot of them are non-academia because of, I had a life before academia in software. So a lot of my friends are there. So I think that's a very helpful, I think the one thing that you said, I think, which is everybody should I should take to heart, which is the wall about judgment. Not let it affect you, except it's consequential in some cases, as you recently see in all this, in how much angst that exists in people. But I think at the end of the day, it's a damn job.
The other thing is I don't meet too many people. I live in a fairly happy cocoon of books and binge watching. So that I think is another good way to go.
What's your binge watching thing? Maybe I should copy your binge watching.
I watch a lot of everything.
I see.
I mean, and I watch also shockingly bad television. I don't even know if I should say it out loud because it might be a bad influence on anyone who's listening. But I'm capable of watching a lot of bad TV. Okay, so let me break it down. So I do listen to some podcasts. I mean, the usual suspects. I'm not very good at listening to like audiobooks and policy podcasts. I just prefer to read a transcript, I have recently assembled a fantastic record collection. So I have been listening to vinyl and I have been listening to a lot of classical music on vinyl. So every day, my husband and I pick one really nice record that each one of us wants to listen to, and then, we will listen to that. So today we were listening to Glenn Gould playing Bach. So I listen to a lot of music. I am deeply embarrassed to say that I recently watched the Sex and the City, whatever, reboot or whatever. It was terrible. This is not a recommendation, but just to be transparent, that's the most recent thing I've binge watched. What about you? What's the most recent thing you've binge watched?
No, I don't have a TV at home. So I'm told you I don't have a TV. And I have everything.
That's why you have a book.
No, I do have my Tamil things I watch, and I watch a lot of cricket stuff that watching clips of, West Indies playing is always like, it lights me up and maybe reminisce the stuff that I actually heard in a radio form before. Now I actually see them, and that's like wonderfully takes me, out of the current milieu. And so, so cricket and comedy is the two different set of things that I kind of enjoy.
Anything in comedy you would recommend?
The Tamil comedy, right? It's at that level. It's not very like sophisticated.
No, it's surprisingly sharp, I had a recent conversation with Arvind Elangovan, and he was talking about how he watches a lot of Vadivelu and, he's
Vadivelu is really like, I think I agree with the characterization about how, I think the phrase that he used was to speak truth to power. I'm not sure whether he speaks truth to power or whether that's a game. So I'm slightly cynical of these people, but it's wonderful in terms of the ability to speak directly, right? I think Tamil, maybe other, I don't know the other languages, but like I think Tamil definitely is much more direct.
It's very sharp. It cuts through all. How do I say this? It cuts through all sort of, power, caste, class, gender. It has that ability to do that. Yeah. Yes. So Vadivelu is something you'd recommend. Anything else?
Even Senthil, right? Senthil Gaudamani. So they, there's a trope of one guy gets beaten up and physical and stuff. But but if you want some class, Nagesh is wonderful. It's slightly older, but the kind of stuff that, again, see, it's also a cultural thing, right? So if you didn't grow up in a certain milieu, you might, I was trying to play with my kids. They're like, I don't know. So it's not clear whether it's gonna translate, across. I think some of these things are very particular. Going back to earlier discussions, so it's very context.
No, and you have to be fluent with the language. I don't know. I don't know if young Indian American kids have that kind of level of fluency with regional languages in India that they can follow the comedy. The comedy is so quick and the words are so specific.
Yeah, the problem is like, wait, tell me what's. I'm like, no, please shut up. I want to get this. So
the fluency in Tamil is one of the blessings of my life. I thank my grandparents for it. Crazy Mohan used to come to Delhi and do all these shows in Tamil Sangam. So I got into Crazy Mohan relatively young, and then started, as an adult, started following up on, he wrote these screenplays and he wrote the dialogues for these movies and so on, and just fell in love with him. And that he was my gateway drug to Tamil comedy.
Oh yeah, you can't stop laughing, right? So you finish to laugh, and you have to like
until you have stitches in your stomach. Yeah, it was fun.
Yeah. For people listening, please check them out. And I think it's a wonderful.
Yeah, now even I'm dating myself, Rajesh. I have Crazy Mohan tapes that were digitized by a family member.
Wonderful. Yeah. Digitization has its value. There you go.
Thank you so much for doing this. This was such a pleasure.
Likewise, Shruti. Thank you so much for taking the time and reading the book. And I think this is the first, outside the circle, you're probably the first person to read the book and engage. So it's wonderful and gratifying. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Ideas of India. If you enjoyed this podcast, please help us grow by sharing with like-minded friends. You can connect with me on Twitter at @SRajagopalan. In the next episode of Ideas of India, I speak with Lant Pritchett about all things governance and economic growth. Also check out our new initiative commemorating 30 years of India's market reforms at the 1991project.com. The 1991 Project is an effort to revive the discourse on growth-centered economic reforms in India by focusing on the economic ideas that drove them. In the coming months, we will publish essays, data visualizations, oral histories, podcasts, and policy papers demystifying the Indian economy and the 91 reforms. You can see all the content and subscribe to our newsletter for updates at the 1991project.com.